Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the good fortune of directing the Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, and it is our great pleasure to be hosting today's session, which we have entitled Climate Adaptation, Development, and Peacebuilding in Fragile States, Finding the Triple Bottom Line. As I think a few of you know, we have been working on the intersection of these topics at the Environmental Change and Security Program since 1994 here at the Wilson Center, the center being the formal memorial to President Wilson, our only president to have a PhD. So Congress set us up as a living memorial, nonpartisan, non-advocacy one, to bring these different communities together, both the researchers and the practitioners, and then in our case, practitioners and scholars from really very different communities, climate change, environment, natural resource management one, development one, and peacebuilding one. And we're very fortunate to have two speakers today who have made it their purpose to try to bridge these gaps. We're also very fortunate today to have in many ways, this is a kickoff to an effort that we've been working on, but not having a lot of meetings focused on. So this is the first meeting under our Resources for Peace project that is supported by USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. And so it's terrific that Neil Levine, who directs that office, is going to kick off our discussion and open it today. We're very pleased that the Environmental Change and Security Program, working with Cynthia Brady at that office most directly and on a very regular basis in terms of trying to think through these issues in practical ways and support some of the efforts that they're doing at the agency, which I should say quite notably, like so many, whether it's bilateral development agencies that we'll hear from Alexander Carius in the German context, we are in our silos in so many instances, and Cynthia and Neil and their colleagues are really finding ways to work across them through the Conflict Management and Mitigation Office. So we are both here to hear about how it's done, but also learn additional ways to do it. A word about this triple bottom line, because Dan Smith and Alexander Carius have both helped us think through these issues in previous iterations of these kinds of discussions that we're having here today. It is one where we are looking for both an analytical understanding of how these things are connected, but then also trying to find some practical ways that they are or could be pursued in the field. And so that is the frame for what we're trying to do with today's discussion. We are webcasting the event live. And so what that means for us here in the room is that when it comes to Q&A, we ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone, let us know who you are, and pose your question so the folks online can hear it. Folks online, if you have a question, particularly early on in the session, if you want to email it to ecsp@wilsoncenter.org, we'll try to get that question into the mix of the Q&A, one that I'm sure will be lively and interesting, so we hope that you can contribute to that as well. So just a quick word about our speaker bios. We had them out front. I hope you picked up a copy along with the participants list. But as I mentioned, Neil Levine will kick us off. He's the director of the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation. We'll go then next to Dan Smith, who is the Secretary General, International Alert, based in London, an NGO that is both doing the thinking on the analytical side and then also a wide range of field-based programs. And so we will hear from him in terms of how they are conceiving this triple bottom line and how they are pursuing it in the field. And then Alexander Carius is co-director of Adelphi Research in Berlin. I think many of you know Adelphi is working closely with the German government, closely with a number of other European governments, and in Brussels with the European Union on the connections of these issues in both analytical and very practical terms. And so we're keen to hear how those institutions are working on these issues, conceiving of these issues. He will also be able to give us an update on some of the German plans for their chairmanship of the Security Council at the UN in this context. So we're eager to hear that larger political context, which may give us additional windows of opportunity for taking on these issues. So I'll turn the floor over now to Neil, and we'll go to Dan and Alex, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So Neil, please, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Yeah, very good. Thank you. Jeff, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I'm delighted to see all of you here. This is, as Jeff mentioned, the launch of the Resources for Peace strategic partnership that our Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation and the Woodrow Wilson Center has launched to really broaden the debate and really provide a true public service in clarifying lots of issues that are very much in the headlines, but also behind that share a complexity that requires the best of what we have in terms of the U.S. government, the private sector, academia, the advocacy community, and I can't think of a better place than the Woodrow Wilson Center to bring that all together. I just wanted to throw out a few numbers sort of to frame our interest in conflict prevention, and natural resources, and then climate change. A recent UN EP report had three numbers that I found very interesting. You can write these down: 40, 2, and 25. And the 40 stands for, at least in the last 60 years, at least 40% of all interstate conflicts have had a link to natural resources. The 2 is that conflicts associated with natural resources are twice as likely to relapse into conflict in the first 5 years following their initial resolution. And then, strangely enough, yet less than a quarter, or 25%, of peace negotiations have addressed resource management mechanisms in the body of the resolution of the conflict or peace negotiation. So this is why we're very concerned with the issue of conflict and natural resources. Moving then to climate change is an area that we would consider to be rather understudied in terms of the connection between climate change and conflict. Lots of headlines, what a colleague of mine have often called not statistics, but data with, or arguments with data as opposed to evidence. And I think one of the another reason for this partnership is really to establish with some clarity the evidence base linking climate change and conflict, or exploring that linkage. We know that it is complex. We know that there are many factors that go into it, and at least teasing that out in a way that we can all understand, both from a scientific perspective, a social science perspective, and then finally, and of course for this audience, a policy perspective. And then lastly, I just wanted to speak a little bit about our approach to funding these kinds of strategic partnerships. When the office, or our office, undertakes a line of activity, we try to look out over the horizon and try to identify the emerging issues in the conflict field that are going to arise on the doorsteps, first of the countries in which we work, and then not soon thereafter on our own shores potentially. And it's to try to get out ahead of the curve in all of these cases. And what we do when we identify these research, we either decide to take on a research course of action either internally, or we contract that out, or we form a strategic partnership with a group or a consortium of interests that have already identified themselves as expert in the field, but bring that expertise one step closer to the policy community and the practitioner community within the government. And this last example of a strategic partnership is something we've done on the policy level with the Woodrow Wilson School here, and also at the field level with the number of partnerships we've had with International Alert over the past several years. And by occupying this nexus, our office, between policy, practice, and academia, we feel that we're able to keep a hand in each of the developments to give our respective agencies and the U.S. interagency a perspective that's somewhat unique, in that we have a presence in Washington, well, among the advocacy community looking at conflict and sustainable development. We have an ability to reach into academia, and then we fund actual operations on the ground, both a small amount that we do, but also through AID's field mission. And our job is to harvest the lessons learned across the board from all of these endeavors and produce publications that speak to the best practice among available to donors. We take this to various donor communities where we're in partnership with Germans, but other bilateral donors, where we try to create a donor consensus around this issue. These forums are especially interesting to us to bring that perspective, particularly in those areas where we have a lot to learn and are oftentimes informed by and inform what the donor practice is. I look forward to a very interesting presentation. I thank you all once again, and please sit back and enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Dan, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you also Neil and USAID and Woodrow Wilson International Center for setting this up.
Dan, if you could pull it a little closer.
Yes,
so
sir?
there you
More
go.
like a rock star and less like an academic. Sure. Can you hear me now? I'm sorry, I have a very growly, throaty voice, and you're just going to have to pay attention. There's actually, for those of you who at the back who are going like this, there are these things called the front row. Let's go straight into this issue of the triple bottom line. What I want to do in really relatively few minutes is talk in fairly general terms and fairly briefly about the issues that Jeff and Neil between them have signaled. And I'm hoping then that in the Q&A that we'll have afterwards, that we'll be able to go into more details. And maybe look at some more specific cases, depending on what you're interested in and on which way you want to take it. The triple bottom line, okay, development, peace, and something good to do with climate. How would you ever think that it would be possible to make progress on one while ignoring the other two? What is the good thing that we're trying to work for in the world? Do we call it peace? Or do we call it development? Or are those just more or less two words for fairly much the same sort of thing? Whether we're talking about Burundi and Rwanda in Central Africa, or we're talking about Kyrgyzstan or Afghanistan in Central Asia, or indeed if we're talking about the USA or the United Kingdom, seems to me like in all those places and in many others, we want prosperity, stability, decent conditions, dignity in our lives. We want the possibility for that. We want governments, community organizations, local state government, provincial assemblies, whatever, that support those goals. And sometimes we get ourselves all tied up in knots by thinking of them as being two different things. I'm sure that people who are in Neil's staff in CMM have had the same experience as I have had of going and talking to people and being told, oh yeah, but you see, you're talking about peace and conflict. We do development. We don't do peace and conflict. To which my answer is, well, if you don't do peace and conflict issues, then you don't do development either. But the thing that we have learned more recently, I mean, I suppose, you know, it's over the past 25 to 30 years that the knowledge has really become general. But it's in the last maybe 10 years that we've started to act on it or tried to act on it in policy research, in policy analysis, in policy making, is that if you don't factor the climate in, if you don't think about nature while thinking about peace and development, then you're kind of thinking about nothing in most places, because it is part of the reality within which people are living. And, you know, just look at the events of the last 6 or 7 months and see how crucial nature has been, whether it's in Japan or Australia or Pakistan or the fires in Russia last summer, let alone going back to the earthquake in Haiti. And one part of what nature does to set our context is something where the issue of climate change arises. So how could you? I think now that the triple bottom line has been identified of development, peace, and climate stability, I think the question is not what does that triple bottom line mean, but how could you ignore it? How could you hope to have an impact on one if you're not working on the other two at the same time? And in some countries, perhaps one can make the argument that it's not necessary. But really, in most places, certainly in every place where international alert works, and we work in only about 25 countries and territories around the world, in most places where USAID is operating, perhaps not everywhere, but the vast majority, most places where the UK Department for International Development is operating, the triple bottom line is a real thing. A couple of years ago, I think we were in this sort of stage of running that particular flag up the flagpole and trying to find out if anybody was going to pay attention once it was up there. I think now where we are, especially in the European debate, is that there's a lot of people paying attention to it, but the real question is, what do we do? What do we do about it? What are the specific things that we do? And what are the specific things that we would do which would be different from what we're already doing? So one other thing which I want to say about the triple bottom line before I move on from repeating that. These three bottom lines each have institutions attached to them. Peace and security has the military, departments of defense, national security establishments attached to them. Development has development donors, USAID, DFID, European Commission, World Bank, UNDP, etc., attached to them. And non-governmental organizations, Oxfams, CARES, Save the Children, World Vision. More recently, the issue of climate has got institutions attached to it as well. Campaigning organizations, departments of governments, parts of the European Commission, the UNFCCC, which runs the climate negotiations. And when you have institutions attached to issues, you've got to think in part about a kind of anthropology, right? Because institutions like issues to be their own. That's where this thing comes from, where people will say, you know, oh, we don't do peace here, we just do development. Because I'm sitting in a development institution, so this is what's real for me. We don't do climate over here, we just do peace and security, because I'm sitting in a military institution or the Defense Department. Or we don't do any of those other things, I just think about climate. And very often individuals, when they step out of their institutional shoes, when they get home, when they're having a drink, when they're chatting to friends, when they're talking to family and so on, those individuals understand all the interlinkages. But when they get back to work the next day, the institutional reality takes over. So part of making the triple bottom line a real thing is to understand that we will have to be working on our own institutions, even the best and the most effective of them, to make sure that they see the interlinkages. Okay, the second thing which I wanted to talk about is why are we talking about this threefold thing at all? About 3.5 years ago, International Alert published a report called A Climate of Conflict, which set out to look at the links between conflict and climate change. And one of the things that we argued was that if you start by looking for direct causality, in other words, if you want to see if it's possible to support the statement climate change causes conflicts, you're already asking the wrong question and walking down the wrong road. Largely because it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to think of a single armed conflict throughout history that has been started by one cause. Right? When people do something as serious as go to war and use violence against each other on a large scale, there's usually a whole pile-up, a proliferation, a conglomeration of reasons for why that happens. And there's no reason to expect that would be any different if one were looking at the role of climate, or the role of poverty, or the role of bad governance, or the role of traumatic memory of the previous war, and all of the other causative factors. So climate sits in alongside of the others. And what it's really to do with is that climate adds to the strains and the stresses that countries are under. Countries that can sometimes barely carry the load they're facing already. Now there's the consequences of climate change maybe coming around the corner to put yet more pressure on them. And this, I think, is why in the US debate, the the concept of a risk multiplier or a conflict multiplier has been used very much. It's multiplying the problems which are already there. But it's important to remember that the problems are already there. Climate and conflict, that problem is as much a problem of governance and conflict, or a problem of poverty and conflict. One of the examples which I've often taken is in the UK and the Netherlands. The UK and the Netherlands are on either side of a sea which we call the North Sea. And the part of England which abuts onto it is very flat. And of course the Netherlands is so flat that it would mostly be underwater if the Dutch hadn't done some miracle engineering to make it into dry land. So floods coming from the North Sea are, you know, all other things being equal, an incredibly dangerous prospect. And in the 1950s, about 1953, 54, there were floods which killed 2,500 people in the Netherlands and the UK. This was from a surge and storms in the North Sea. 3-4 years ago, the highest ever surge in the level of the North Sea was recorded. And the number of casualties was absolutely zero. A few people were moved from their homes on a precautionary basis and moved back in. Why was that? Because of all of the wealth of the UK and the Netherlands, and their wealth, not only in economic wealth, but institutional wealth, which made it possible to prevent that natural event from causing any serious disastrous effects. Transpose that same kind of scenario to Bangladesh, right? Without that wealth and without that institutional strength. And every year the inundations are a serious humanitarian problem in Bangladesh. So it's the strength of governance, it's the fact that the UK and the Netherlands are not poverty-stricken countries that are as important as climate change in deciding whether or not the consequences of climate change, or indeed any natural event, are going to be a disaster for the country concerned. There are about 1.5 billion people worldwide living in countries that face these multiple stresses from that take in the form of extreme violence of either political or criminal nature, and that are generated in one way or another by this complex of challenges of governance, poverty, climate, traumatic memory of war, regional conflicts, and so on. They are facing interlinked problems, and interlinked problems, almost by definition, require interlinked solutions. The word which I would put on the interlinked solution to describe the policy goal which we should be supporting is the goal of resilience. Resilient communities, resilient societies, resilient government structures. And in some ways, I think that one of the things which the climate change community, those people who, when they feel that they need an institutional identification, say, yes, but I'm in a climate institution, that much newer community than the other two, the development or the security communities. One of the things that those people need to have the courage to do is to say, look, the climate agenda goes well beyond climate. Don't think just about climate. One of the things that emerges in the climate debate and in the discourse when you focus onto the issue of security and governance is it's the whole question of adaptation. How do communities and countries, societies, governments adapt? What are the measures that should be brought in to adapt to face the consequences of climate change? If you think about this in terms of trying to identify what the specific consequences are and thinking of adaptation measures, sort of a measure for a consequence, then the problem you're going to have is that we do not know. We are living in a world where this whole thing that Donald Rumsfeld introduced and has been haunting us with ever since he said it, the unknown unknowns, are very, very real, right? What we need are institutions and policies and actions which guard us not only against the threats that we can see coming, they're the easy ones, but against the ones that we can't see coming. Well, if we can't see them, how can we guard against them? By developing resilience. By developing the capacity to absorb information, for example, in the form of warnings, digest it, disseminate it, act on it, respond to it. That means, for example, that there needs to be trust within a society. I'll give you just one example to indicate what I'm meaning. Along the banks of the Zambezi River in Mozambique, communities know when a flood is coming because the ants move. Right? Because the earth gets very damp and the ants come out of their ant holes and ant hills and they move around, they go somewhere else. And so in the village you sort of say, oh, ants, pack your bags, we're heading for the hills. One year some people from the government, because of funding and information and so on, and data management, which they had had assistance in from outside, they had information and there was going to be a cyclone. And they came along to the to villages and they said, there are going to be floods. And the village elders said, no ants. Can't see the ants. So they stay where they are. I don't know if you remember, about a decade ago, those pictures of people being picked up from trees in Mozambique, these huge expanses of water. I mean, it was like Australia, what was happening in Queensland, only writ large. Right? And that was why, that was that occasion. What does that tell you? First of all, that reliable information system of the ants didn't apply to this particular circumstance. Secondly, that given the choice between trusting the ants and the government, the village elders chose the insects. This tells you something about what needs to be worked on if Mozambique is to develop greater resilience. And maybe there's some other unknown heading in Mozambique's or Tanzania's or Kenya's direction. And you need to be trusting the government more than you can trust the insects. And honestly, in some of those countries, it's not a tough choice at the moment. You take the ants every time. With better information, you can get better risk management. With better risk management, you can get priorities and allocations. With the context which makes it possible for better information, you can have and need more social and citizen participation, both in deciding what actions need to be taken and in carrying them out. And participation will turn out to be the key in an awful lot of countries which at the moment, and for maybe the next decade or two, don't have the institutional strength. So I want to leave it more or less there. I want to leave with one last little bit of a message, though, which we can also explore further in questions if need be. The European political context is a lot more conducive for discussing these issues than the American one. The British government has declared that there are two major security threats in the 21st century. And it puts these threats far ahead of things like nuclear proliferation or direct attack upon the country, for example, that risk. There are two. One is international terrorism, and the other one is the long-term consequences of climate change. So that's the government has stated this. This is part of our strategic defence planning. Right? So, yes, we have a conducive political environment for making these arguments. But and in different ways in other European countries and in the EU as a whole, and the European Union institutions based in Brussels, it's similar. But, you know, we're Europeans. I mean, so we're great at thinking. So we've done an awful lot of thinking. We've got a lot of ideas, a lot of questions, a lot of good theory. Right? But the question, so what do we actually do? That question is, I don't think we are particularly further ahead on that question in our more politically conducive environment on the eastern side of the Atlantic than people are over here. So there is a chance here for a very, really advanced level cooperation in working this out. What we're looking for, I think, is action that is real at the level of villages where the ants are or aren't. which is supported by a national framework in whether it's Mozambique or Nepal or wherever, that makes possible for people to get engaged in the actions that build greater resilience, supported as necessary from regional and international organizations with knowledge, with training, with money to mobilize activities. Right? There's a huge task to be done there. It's multi-level. There's an awful lot of questions and an awful lot of things that need to be done. Yes, I think that the European discussion is a lot further advanced, but I'm not really, I don't know, Alexander may disagree, but I don't really think that European action is a great deal further advanced. Perhaps here and there in small bits and pieces. But overall, the picture is one of, listen, this is a new open field with a big set of important issues. Let's all get engaged. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dan. Alexander?
Yeah, thank you. So Dan, you leave the question for the very concrete steps to me.
Yeah.
I'm very familiar with this argument of evidence and the lack of data when it comes to taking decisions, and I would like to pick up on this. We are asked quite often by international organizations or government agencies when they approach us or other institutions to help them to make any kind of prediction about future climate wars or climate change as a trigger for conflict, how the world would look like in 20, 30, 40 years from now, and how governments and aid agencies should prepare themselves. What I normally ask them is, imagine that we can give you that answer. Imagine that we can exactly determine in which of the countries you're not present at that state. You should focus your future government spending, or you should intensify the work that they are doing on either one of those triple line components or looking at the nexus of water, food, energy, security issues. Would your policies differ from that? And would your institution be capable in order to address this kind of complexity on the one hand and also uncertainty? Normally they don't give me an answer to that, but I give an answer to myself, which is not, the institutions are not really capable to do that. And so the question for me is, so how can we frame this kind of conceptual issue and the kind of risk assessments that we are carrying out, paying attention to this kind of complexity so that it is applicable to the way institutions work. Years ago, I always argued for a more integrated policy process. Today, I would argue for an integrated assessment of the issues, but to a certain degree, even on a long run, then you have to nail it down or at least transfer it or translate it back into very sectoral approaches. Because institutions have only limited capacities for coordination, and they also have limited capacities in order to develop and implement programs. Looking back over the past couple of years, I asked myself whether we really advanced very much from, let's say, 2006, 2007, when the entire debate of climate and security was kicked off at the UN level, because the UK government at that time launched a debate in the UN Security Council about the wider security implications of climate change, with a series of reports by, you mentioned one by International Alert, but there is a series of reports that came out, commissioned reports by government agencies looking at the interface by climate change and security and natural resources and conflict. Which kicked off a debate in Europe and also a debate at the UN level. And I just would like to spend a few minutes on looking at these two policy processes, which I would say it's the political domain, and it's a very conceptual and political debate that we have on the one hand, but then also share with you a couple of experiences how aid agencies, and even within the UN system, a couple of agencies deal with this in very concrete terms, which is something like a bottom-up approach. Where we are at the moment since 2007, it was under German EU Council presidency that they requested the High Representative and the Commissioner for External Relations to come up with a joint report on the security implications of climate change, which kicked off a process at the EU level to think about on the challenges on the one hand and also the measures that EU institutions have available to address this challenge. It ended up in a so-called roadmap process in 2009 with a couple of more precise recommendations to the European Commission or European institutions to factoring in climate change as a trigger of conflict or multiplier of conflicts into the 5-year programming cycles for development assistance, for instance. A more conceptual thinking of how to address the question of climate adaptation, especially in those countries which are either prone to conflict or considered to be fragile or unstable, and asking the question whether adaptation strategies at a domestic level have to be implemented in a different way compared to stable countries or other countries. You're totally right that looking back at what happened at the EU level, that there was a slowdown in 2010 last year, and that is true until today, that none of the recommendations and good ideas have been taken forward. It has been argued at the European level that it was a bad moment of time because we had a new commission coming in, and that was considered the external dimension of the EU is now changing with a new external action service that is developing. It's established but still developing, and EU external relations is under revision at the moment. So much of the political momentum that existed with this joint paper by the external relations representatives ended up in a very technical, low-level dialogue at that point, and I don't see much of the political momentum coming back. There is an attempt by the German government at the moment to bring this back onto the agenda of the General Affairs Council at the spring meeting of this presidency. So we will see whether this is going to be picked up. Interesting enough, in the past couple of years, is that we had a parallel track at the UN level, followed by the UK attempt to discuss that without much discussion, at least launching it in the UN Security Council. There were a couple of political momentum created at the UN level when there was a debate on the likely implications of security, of climate change for security in the General Assembly, followed by a report by the Secretary General outlining potential security risks, but not really making precise recommendations on where to go and who is actually challenged by that. So there is a parallel event that we have a very high political attention, or at least a higher political attention in the political arena for that subject, but without having really a clear mandate of what that means. The report has been criticized also by myself, is that it did not really specify what the UN system itself should do about that. And that takes me to the second part of looking at bottom up, or looking at the existing spectrum of initiatives, both at the EU, the UN, but also at the domestic level, and much is with domestic institutions. I recently talked to a senior government official who plays an active role in the climate negotiations, and we discussed the interface of climate and security issues and to what extent that relates to his government politics. And he said, well, I'm not sure, but I'm not remembering any of the studies saying exactly that 44.8% of climate change is responsible for the conflict in Sudan. I did not ask him whether he is much familiar with those studies saying that 6.4% was poverty and 7.3% was governance. I think that indicated already that, especially from the point of view of climate change, my impression is that most of the policymakers are very much reluctant on taking on the climate and security and the conflict and natural resource argument on board. When you look at those who are dealing with conflict prevention and conflict mitigation, especially at the level of 8 agencies, or those 8 agencies I'm working with, not exclusively in Germany with the GIZ and KfW Development Bank, is that there is a certain openness and also a certain experience of institutions dealing with the complex assessment of projects and programs, both when it comes to the preparation of projects and programs and also the implementation and later on initiating and implementing learning processes starting from evaluation and learning exercises. They are familiar with peace and conflict impact assessments. They are familiar with all sorts of do no harm mechanisms which already look at secondary effects, which already looked at this, as you call it, triple bottom line, or the different nexus, the relationship it has to poverty, to governance, to security sector reform, etc. So to the core of what belongs into the development context arena under the label of conflict and security. And the German government asked us end of last year, to start a process of looking at the instruments that they have available for addressing the different aspects when it comes to the interface of climate change, conflict, and security issues. One of them is the peace and conflict impact assessment methodologies they have in hand. The other is to look at the climate proofing tools, which is now further developed from a climate proofing into a climate and sustainability proofing, not only for technical projects, but also for large-scale investment. And it's quite interesting to learn that I think there is much more available within, in terms of knowledge and methodologies within the institutions, both at the level of the headquarters and also if you go down to the local programs, than we would expect from looking for a more programmatic or policy level at that. Part of the exercise is to make this knowledge accessible and visible, and I think there are rooms like the OECD ready to share that among donor agencies, because I think this is not exclusive to German aid agencies, but true to other institutions, not only government institutions, that there is a lot of knowledge that needs to be generated. Jeff and I, we are both member of an expert advisory group to the United Nations Environment Program, and Erica, looking at environment and conflict issues. And we had a meeting with part of that group last week in New York with the UN bodies dealing with peacekeeping and peace building. And it was quite an interesting approach, because what we have learned over the past 2 years is that it is the peacekeeping operators and those who are involved in peace-building processes who approached United Nations Environment Program and other entities, also non-governmental institutions, and say, look, we're not really totally aware of how natural resources and conflict relate to each other. But what we do is that whenever we plan for peacekeeping operations, whenever we plan for refugee camps, we come across questions of natural resources. So coming back to this idea of is there evidence, I think there is very much evidence from by people in the field, not in this very systematic way of developing models, etc., and to exactly knowing how they deal with that, but at least there is evidence that much of the work that aid agencies are doing on the ground is interrelated. And it's interesting that they're asking for tools, and some of the institutions are asking for very practical tools. And one of the experience that we made is that coming from a more conceptual point of view, and I am familiar with most of the assessment methodologies that have been developed on very complex relationships between climate and security, and how climate change is also affecting natural resource management and natural resource conflict, is that most of the institutions are not really, the closer they are to local programs, interested in these large-scale sophisticated programs, but they would like to have us and others to translate that into very practical terms. And it was interesting that that was 2.5 years ago, we've been asked to develop a conflict analytical framework for the United Nations Environment Program to address the natural resource components in the post-conflict needs assessment. So specifically looking at post-conflict situations and how to factor in the natural resource component into then peacekeeping, peace-building efforts. We designed a I wouldn't say a sophisticated tool, but at least a more complex tool, and presented this to a wider audience of UN institutions in New York. And I think it was wise from our client to have us presenting that, because they didn't know whether they will like it. And I guess they were a little bit surprised that they liked it, but they came to us with a very concrete recommendation, basically saying, we designed something that started with pre-assessment and a consultative process that goes for a couple of months. And they ask us, first of all, to nail it down to no more than 2 pages, and to make it usable for us so that we can use it for 2 days missions. I was a little bit frustrated when I learned that. But in the meantime, I think they're right, because what I have learned, especially at the UN level, by planning then peacekeeping missions, you have a very small window of opportunity where you can make the argument of natural resource component. And in most of the cases, natural resources, or the question of global climate change or global environmental change, is not a separate track among the more obvious things like security sector reform, or building stable government institution, or the capacity building for regional or domestic governance per se, but it goes onto the governance umbrella. So you have a very small, very short moment of time where you can then have to provide assistance to those who are not experts on environmental issues, but do then the preparation of, for instance, peacekeeping missions. And I guess that gives us an idea of where we actually have to give advice to aid agencies, and can help them to translate this very rich experience that we have, both from from the academic work that is in the field, but also generating it from field practitioners, and from the different experiences that aid agencies made over the time, to put this and further develop this into very concrete terms. To a final comment of how both things are related. I think they are related, and both of the developments are dependent on each other. Most of the institutions working on that have a very specific mandate, and be it the UN with their different bodies, or be it domestic aid agencies, all of them face the same constraints: limited human resources, narrow windows of time, a lot of bureaucracy around, etc. So we have to be very precise, and I think we have to organize a structure that is reliable to them. And with reliable, I mean to create a political mandate. It is difficult for the UN Environment Programme to act beyond environmental issues, even though they have a 6 priorities, and number 6 is disasters and conflict issue. It is difficult for them really to act on its own in conflict and environment unless they are asked by the mandated institutions. So the question of whether we have a policy in place at the EU level, whether we have very precise, at least recommendations to development programming, it is difficult really for institutions to act. I'm not totally sure about the motivation of the German government to put climate change and security into the Security Council under German Council presidency in July. But they will do it, and they are supported by a couple of other countries to discuss climate and security in the Security Council. The way I see that is that it could help to create legitimacy for at least making the argument, the very strong argument, that climate change has an impact on security. There is always the discussion, both at academia and among policy institutions, whether climate change is now more a question of human security or in the traditional sense, security. I never found this debate very fruitful, because it's not the question if it's one or the other, it's both. It affects, of course, local livelihoods. So it is a question of human security. But in some cases, and that's the argument and one of the motivations to bring it to the Security Council, it also affects, in a very traditional sense, question of security, and that is state sovereignty. So when climate change is resulting in sea level rise and affects the small island states to an extent that the population needs to move from the islands to other parts of the world, that the sea borders are diminishing. I think that's the core of international law, and it affects state sovereignty. So I see that, in a sense, as a litmus test. Not sure how this debate will end. As a litmus test whether we could come up with some sort of recommendation as a presidential statement or whatever will be the outcome of the Security Council meeting, making very precise recommendations on how the UN system itself and the global arena should react to that. And I think it will be a fruitful and successful debate the more precise it is and the more challenging it is to the UN system itself. As I said in the beginning, it was one of the shortcomings of the report of the Secretary General to say that there are likely security implications, missing to say that what are the security implications, when do they manifest, if that is some sort of likeliness to materialize in the future, and if we would face these kind of consequences, which institution would deal with that. So at that place, I think it is important really to speed up the debate and create legitimacy to have policy processes at this macro level. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I'd like to thank you both for your remarks and Neil for his framing of this discussion. Let me throw out a couple questions to get the conversation started, then we'll turn to the audience. We obviously framed this in terms of trying to find the positive in that triple bottom line and building some of those capacities, those institutional approaches that could be beneficial across the three, with the notion that if there would at least be opportunity costs if you didn't do that, and it actually could be counterproductive. I would like to ask you both to reflect a bit more on the counterproductive perspective, in part with this almost from where I know Neil and Cynthia and colleagues are starting in terms of looking at the investments in climate change and trying to initially do no harm vis-a-vis development and peacebuilding and conflict. And so reflecting on how much or how little you see as a challenge under this rubric, the opportunities to actually make things work in a peacebuilding context by trying to do right by climate. So how are our interventions in responding to climate change in one realm potentially presenting problems in another, say, conflict? I'm thinking, for example, of RED schemes, reduced emissions from deforestation, forest degradation. Do you see prospects for that actually causing problems in one of these other sectors? As just one example. And then, Dan, I know you've spoken a lot in some other contexts about the climate financing and obviously the importance of having real resources to put against these issues, but then also the questions of having this discussion early on so that the mechanisms are set up in a way that they can capture these benefits and potentially avoid these shortfalls if we don't have these conversations across the different objectives.
The risks of trying to do good. I mean, even in the IPCC report in 2007, they were talking about possibilities of maladaptation, where you adapted to the pressure of climate change, but by doing that, did something which was counterproductive for a group somewhere. Let me give you an example, at least, of what the problems are or might be. Bangladesh, in its sort of national strategy about climate change, foresees that there may be 20 million people displaced through loss of coastline in the Delta region. Now, this has to be understood in context. It's distinct from the throughput of people in the Delta region. The Delta in Bangladesh, constantly land is being lost and people move away. And, for example, they go to the Chittagong Hills, where there are social pressures which result there, or they try to emigrate to India, which is literally building a physical barrier to stop that from happening, or they go to Dhaka, the capital, where they just join the urban poor. But the land which is lost from the movement of the Delta is, so to speak, regained somewhere else. And so other people from other parts of Bangladesh then migrate to the Delta. So the extraordinary thing which some people have failed to understand is that for as many people leave the Delta region, there are other people who come into it, and there's a kind of a throughput of population through there. In addition, on top of that mobility, the Bangladeshi government foresees the loss of habitat, just the loss, delete it, for 20 million people as a result of inundation from the sea. So what's the next line in the Bangladesh national strategy? Right? Well, actually, there isn't one. They just move on. It's the strangest bit of the document, the strangest bit of any document you can imagine. Here is serious problem. Now we move on and we look at it as something else. Obviously, what is needed at that point is some kind of strategy. First of all, to figure out, is 20 million just essentially a guesstimate, or is it a more precise figure? Is there a methodology behind it? Let's try to pin this figure down. Over what kind of period of time are we talking about that? 20 million people in a year is one thing. 20 million people over 30 or 40 years is a much more manageable kind of issue. And then there are the thoughts about, well, in what ways could Bangladesh manage such an issue? If they were to do so by saying, well, there's lots of space in the Chittagong Hills, so people can move there, right, then what you know is that that adaptation measure would run a high risk of causing violence in the Chittagong region. And it's already happening from people moving there in unplanned ways, and it would happen from people moving there in planned ways. So social consequences around the movement of people. If a lot of the challenge of climate change is to losing habitable land, is to losing bits of the human habitat, and so you move people to other parts of habitable land, you move them, or those people will move to places where already other people are trying to make a living. They're trying to get by, and it's not easy, and the income has put too much of a burden on. So unless you think about how to, in a sense, adapt to the consequences of your adaptation, there's constantly the possibility that you will be led astray by simply focusing on a narrow part of the problem and seeing it as a specific adaptation challenge, rather than thinking about how do we strengthen resilience in society so that it can face these problems more. The other question which you asked, the one about climate financing, I think that this is something where really virtually no progress has been made since I was speaking about it in this building a couple of years ago. It's still the case that the focus in terms of adaptation financing is on putting shed loads of money on the table so that it can be used to support adaptation. And a couple of years ago, as we moved up towards Copenhagen, there was sort of $10 billion was coming out, and then $50 billion was coming out, and then World Bank estimates were saying it needed to be somewhere between $50 and $150 billion. And then a group in London, where we're all very moderate people, as you know, the English are very sensible and commonsensical, said, well, no, it's close to $325 billion per year by 2030, and so on and so forth. So the figures are enormous, and there's a huge concentration on that. Then there's a concentration on, a big focus on, how is the money provided? Right? People from rich countries tend to think that the money should be provided. It'll be coming from taxpayers' money, so it should be provided by governments or maybe through something like the World Bank, and it should be accountable, and we should have targets and value for money and cost effectiveness and so on. And people from poorer countries which feel that they have been victimized by carbon production in the rich north, they use an analogy like a car accident. You ran me over in the street. I was just minding my own business, and your big black tinted window SUV mounted the pavement and mowed me down. And now you're going to compensate me. And then literally adding its insult to injury, you're going to tell me how to spend the compensation money? Excuse me, if I want to spend that money on a holiday in St. Lucia, on 15 large screen televisions on the second floor of my house, or on a new set of clothes, that's my business, it's not yours. So there's these two different models. There's a sort of a development aid model of providing climate financing, which adaptation financing, which should be accountable and targeted and so on. And there's a compensation model in which those who provide the money then get out of the argument after that. And of course you can see that which way the politics are going to wash on this in different parts of the world. So those are the two big things which are being focused on. The thing which is not being focused on is, yes, but how do you spend that money? On what is that money going to be spent? How are we going to be sure that that money does good and not harm? Throw large sums of money at problems in very poor countries, and there are a lot of people who are very good at getting their hands on that money and getting it away. I mean, corruption is not a small issue. And the role of predatory elites in fragile states and poor countries is a part of the problem which is faced, and it is not wrong, it's not out of order even for us in the rich north to think about the way in which predatory elites get in the way or could get in the way of good use of adaptation money in the south. So I think that we're still there. We're still focusing on how much and governed by whom, and we're not thinking enough about for what purpose. And that's the gap which needs to be filled by answering that question, yes, but what do we do, how do we do it, and who does it?
I remember that a few years ago, I think it was in Brussels, we raised this issue of conflict-sensitive adaptation strategies and
very well,
and the way aid agencies can support that. That is one way of approaching that. But I was thinking about, if you look at, I mean, one thing that all the adaptation measures, whether you call that NAPA or other kind of investment, they have one thing or two things basically in common. One is large-scale financial investment, no matter whether it comes from the donor community or generated by domestic sources. And the other one is that it's not just about investment in one technology, but it's about transformation of the economy and society in a country. The question is a country prepared for that? And when it comes to the larger implications, especially if you look at the natural environment, is the entire region and neighboring countries or the regional governance structure prepared for that? When I said earlier that there is a lot of momentum and activities going on at the EU level and UN level, it is always argued that we have to factor this into regional strategies and regional organizations, which are very slow, as slow as multilateral organizations to do that, but they are closer to the problem. And when it comes to the identification of strategic and regional risks, they are much more averse and sensitive to that. One example is we've been asked by the Nile Basin Initiative to do a service on the likely climate change implications for the Nile riparian states over the next 20 years, basically looking at the different models that exist. And one of the results in the study was that we know very little about the impacts on individual Nile riparian states. But that was not the problem. The problem is that the study is for nothing unless it is discussed in this regional context. And the Nile riparian states refuse to do that in this regional context because there's a lot of risks involved in that report. So if regional institutions or if the governance structure to discuss this with all the strategic implications involved, how could we then expect from either the donor agency or from the respective countries to sufficiently reflect larger implications that go beyond the borders? Most of the domestic plans, I think, are in, and that's the good thing of the entire discussion, are still in an infant stage. I mean, there is spending, there is a lot of international assistance to developing adaptation strategies, but the money is slowly flowing into that. And everybody knows that even if it goes into large-scale technical infrastructure of building dams or large-scale agricultural systems, it is an investment over a very long period of times. And if you cut across the different, or look at the different reports dealing with the initial experiences of conducting the adaptation planning, I think what is interesting is that's very much framed as a discourse that needs guidance. So a facilitated debate, because it is recognized more and more as a societal process that transforms society. And I guess that allows us really to enter into the debate and to make then the argument about larger effects and secondary effects of climate change, adaptation, infrastructure, investment, etc. But as I said, without the regional context, I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but that is not in the hands of aid agencies at that point.
Okay. Well, why don't we throw it open to the audience for some additional questions, and Neil and Alex and Dan will respond. Who would like to kick us off from the field? We'll have a hand down here, and then Tim in the back.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for the interesting comments. Just to follow up on what you said before, how do you see the role of measurement, reporting, verification in that, and what are the spillover effects of national appropriate mitigation schemes and to adaptation schemes, and is there actually an integrated assessment of either of those? Thank you very much.
And could you let us know who you are, sir?
Oh, yeah, I'm Markus Springmann from the German Institute for Economic Research in Berlin.
Okay, terrific. We're going to take a couple here first. So, Kaylee, all the way in the back, Tim Resch.
Tim Resch, I work for USAID in the Africa Bureau. It strikes me that some people are defining conflict a little bit too narrowly. So I was struck by the comment that institutionally conflict is the purview of the military as an institution. When some of the leanings I heard were armed conflict and national or subnational conflict, and I think there's two other kinds of much lower level conflict that occurs that's part of global climate change. One is the inability of governments to deal with climate variations, droughts, floods, changes in economic systems, and the other is on the carbon finance side, the inability of governments to deal equitably with payments for ecosystem services. And so to the extent that an ecosystem services is a benefit to national governments, and how those are equitably distributed, and if they're not equitably distributed, or if it means changes in land occupation or such, that results in low-level conflict that sometimes is effectively suppressed by governments, and in other cases it boils over to governmental change and armed conflict.
Okay, why don't we take those two, and then we can come back to the audience for questions, the kind of mitigation, adaptation, and then our conflict definitions.
You mean?
A good question is on MRV. To be honest, I didn't think about it. I'm not totally sure whether that is relevant at that stage. First of all, in terms of integrated assessment, as I said, for measurement and reporting, I'm not totally sure whether that where I see the entry point. There is. I recently came across in another context where we do capacity building in the South Caucasus about national communications of a couple of the South Caucasian countries, and we talked to the government agencies about their different scenarios that they are using for climate change adaptation. And the question that they ask us to address in the series of trainings is, so how do we deal with the question of uncertainty? To what extent that relates to your question is that the question of reporting is very much following a mandatory process that government agencies or countries are not very familiar with. They need a lot of technical assistance from the outside. So most of the national communications are written by external experts. In that case, it was the Hadley Center assisting them in developing, under a grant of UNDP, the different scenarios for that country and for the entire region. They did it in all 3 South Caucasus states. And they are far away of really making then the linkage for an integrated assessment and also an integrated reporting. So they are serving the different demands of reporting to either the conventions, or not only one, but to several conventions, without really doing an integrated assessment which then reflects the different requirements. So in terms of the security dimension or the conflict dimension of that, I think there is no indication really to relate that to the MRV.
I just wanted to say one thing about the integrated assessment issue. I am one of those who bangs on about people's thoughts being stovepiped, policies being not integrated, the failure to take whole of government approaches, etc., etc., etc. And one of the things that I've realized in the last 2 or 3 years is that there's an awful lot of us who are doing that. It's very common, right? Now, you could take a pessimist's view of it and say, yes, you know, everybody realizes it, and yet still the institutions are stovepiped. And that, rhetorically, is the position which I would take. But I also think that it's fair enough to take an optimist's view of it as well and say, yeah, actually, increasingly this problem is being recognized. Increasingly this is coming into the intellectual formation of the discussion and of people who are entering these career structures and these institutions. And actually, increasingly you see signs where governments and institutions are trying to take these steps towards some kind of integrated approach. They are a long way from being there yet, but there is more awareness and more willingness to try to be aware about the problems now than there was a few years ago. I mean, the idea of interagency working groups, of national security councils, which include the aid agency alongside the foreign ministry and the defense department and so on, all of these things are more standard. The External Action Service in the EU also speaks for this kind of a degree of integration, which of course in practice it's not fully achieving yet. But the very fact that it sits there as an aspiration is already important. It's different from how it was 15 years ago. And perhaps these institutions will take a long time to move, but there is kind of glacial movement beginning. The question about the broadening of the conflict definitions, I take on board what you're saying, and I think that one can indeed push it a bit further than that. Mexico. Right? Maybe it's enough just to say the word, Mexico. It challenges what our standard notions of armed conflict are. If you look at the academic definitions and the ones that most of us are working with, it's very much about politics. It's about having incompatible political demands, a lack of institutional arrangements for one reason or another, which makes it possible to manage and pursue the conflict, and therefore people turn to arms in support of their cause. And then, of course, as the fighting goes on, maybe you get groups which need to raise money through criminal actions, or you start to get a blurring of the line between the political and the criminal. But always our conflict definitions, if you take the standard ones which are used in things like the Human Security Report and so on, they trace back to political incompatibility. But maybe the kind of violence and the kind of conflicts which we're going to be seeing, and it might be particularly, although I'm not sure about this, within the context of thinking about the impact of climate change alongside of the other factors, maybe these are going to be much more about social conflicts and of a kind of conflict which, while organized, fits more our definition or our concept of criminal rather than our concept of political. still we're going to have to deal with that problem, right? And whether that's in Mexico, or we're thinking Mumbai and Lagos, or we're thinking about the issue of urbanization and the megacities, and more than half the world's population living in cities now, and that proportion increasing at extraordinary rates, with city infrastructures and infrastructure of governance completely unable to cope with the pressure which that's putting on. Therefore, the rise of, let's call them informal authorities, informal powers who are controlling areas, making them no-go for the state authorities, for the police or whomever. I think all of these issues need probably to be brought more into the forefront of our thinking about violent conflict across the coming couple of decades. And I think they provide an awful lot of practical issues, practical problems. Whose consent do you need in order to be able to do projects of building resilience and adaptation to climate and other problems in an area, in a city like Mumbai or in a city like Lagos? Whose actual consent do you need? Who are not just the non-state actors, but the actual criminal actors, that if they're not on board, then the adaptation and the resilience building is not going to happen? Is it legitimate to approach such groups? Comes down also to, for example, negotiating over hostages if there's kidnaps being undertaken. Can the International Committee of the Red Cross do that in the way that it has negotiated with some pretty difficult types across the last 140 years of its existence? I mean, the ICRC doesn't have real difficulty negotiating with the Taliban, but it's not so straightforward for them to negotiate with or to mediate negotiations with a Mexican drug cartel. So I think that this issue which you raised of the definition of conflict, which we're thinking about in this context, is a very, very rich one indeed.
Neil, could I ask you to reflect on both trends and if you see in which direction they're going in that interagency collaboration and joined-up government perspective, and also perhaps on how you're treating and seeing the conflict definition issue?
Yeah, actually, I was going to hold back just because a lot of my comments would echo what Dan said. I would say, very much an optimist in terms of the ability of the interagency to take these issues on board. And I say that because a simple reflection, from my experience now 17, 18 years at AID, maybe 5 years ago, it would be an anomalous situation where we would reach out to, on a regular basis on a topic, to have military and State Department regularly with the state and aid cooperate on a daily basis. But I would say certainly about 10 years ago, and then with increasing vibrancy and frequency, a lot of the business that we do is done on an interagency basis. So I would say now, to the point that a week does not go by that I and my staff wouldn't find ourselves in an interagency environment, and that would go beyond the 3Ds, but also would bring in the intelligence community and a lot of the domestic agencies as well. But I do think your observation that and this is not just us, it's other donors as well, but we have not made it easy on ourselves in terms of the bureaucratic structures don't always adapt. Like anything, people who find good working relationships, people that answer their questions, solve their problems, and they find a benefit of working together, and so it reinforces. But for the areas and the countries we've done, I think 10 years ago, you would find the link up most between AID and military would be in massive humanitarian situations where it got beyond the ability of the civilian capacities of government to deal with, and the military would be brought in. There would be a lot of coordination. And then I think largely because of the hot wars we face in Afghanistan and Iraq, a whole new kind of avalanche of interagency connections have been built, and a lot of experience between aid officers serving jointly in conflict environments has kind of made those networks of contacts much more vibrant, much more in the daily routine, such that, this is part of our culture in terms of interagency. I would say that I am prepared to stand apart from this because at some points, whole of government needn't be all of government, and it needn't be whole of government, all of government, all the time. And I think what we've tried to sort through is as these contacts have gotten more urgent, more frequent, we need to identify those relationships that best advance the joint interests of the agencies and the foreign policies that's on the table without getting bogged down in massive bureaucratic exercises that have, it's great to be participatory, but that can get in the way of some of the execution that we try. In terms of the last conflict, and again, bringing up the Mexico example and sort of the new face of conflict where they talk about red-on-red conflict or cartels settling scores. This is an area I think that the Wilson Center has looked into through the Mexico program quite closely. What does that mean for the U.S. government in terms of not a country where the government is party to the conflict, but is actually trying to get a handle on conflict that's taking place within its borders? And you raise a really interesting question, both in terms of our framework for understanding that, and then, of course, what is our policy towards those types of conflicts, and is this really the new face of conflict? CMM, for its part, has recognized what we call illicit power structures, for want of a better name, of these criminal syndicates, terrorist groups, guerrilla operations that blur those lines, how they operate in these countries and have a profound effect on the political economy of the countries in which we're operative, yet they don't yield easily to analytical study. It's not easy to go out and interview folks. You're left largely with the academic and secondary literature, but you know that they're very, very important. So in collaborations with the Africa Bureau and the Latin America Bureau, we're undertaking a line of research to really give ourselves some analytical frameworks to try to analyze and unpack what drives these networks to form, how do they do business, where are they prevalent, and how, most importantly, how do they manifest in the political economy of the countries that we're operating. We're at the very beginning of that analytical inquiry, but it does suggest to us kind of the next horizon of problem set that we'll be dealing with.
Alexander, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just one comment on interagency collaboration. I think I would like to make a distinction between the domestic level and the European or UN level. I also made this argument that we need more collaboration. I think the challenge is much more sometimes at the domestic level to cooperate among entities within an organization. So if I look at the work. We have the privilege at the moment really to have a very deep insight or get deep insight into what GIZ and KfW are doing, so the both entities of German aid. It is very much of bringing the sectoral and the regional departments together and to collaborate between those who are doing conflict prevention, conflict mitigation issues, and natural resource management, which is sometimes much more difficult within institutions than to have formal collaboration. Because I mean, if I look at the climate and security or natural resources and conflict work in Germany and compare the ministries, what could the Ministry for the Environment add to the debate? Because those specialists who are working on the interface are sitting anyway in terms of developing programs, mostly in the Ministry for Development Cooperation and in the aid agencies. The Ministry for the Environment has another task. I mean, they do a lot of normative work. They're working on the global conventions, in that case on climate change, but on others like water, in the UNECE context, for instance, or they support river basin organizations, but do much of the normative work. Much of the practical work, and when it comes then to the development of tools, is the collaboration and within. And one of the obstacles that I come across, and it's not just in Germany, same thing of Austria to a lesser degree, and Switzerland case that I worked on a couple of years ago, is to then challenge this into the regional departments, because most of the money sits in the regional departments. They are then developing the programs, and they are very much relying on what sectoral departments give them on hand or what kind of program they suggest. So that is my experience. That most of the constraints exist within institutions. I don't know if that holds true to DFID in the UK, because if you then look at the EU, for instance, the level of collaboration between directorates when it comes to this issue is close to zero. I mean. In the few years that I work with the Commission on this subject, it is very much DG Relics, Foreign Affairs, that pushed that forward. DG Development was very. I mean, they do say that this is important, but they really fear at a certain point really to bring in all this very complex nexus work on climate, food security. Water issues into the programming then for their entire programming cycle, and then put this into regional programs. Yeah.
Okay. Some other questions from the audience, right there. Yeah, please, from State.
Yes. Hi. I'd really, I think, want to use this as make a supportive comment along the lines of what all three of the presenters have been saying in terms of our direct experience at the State Department. My name's David Lippian, and I work for the Undersecretary for Democracy and Global Affairs at State. And we are literally right now in the process of thinking about how to implement the recommendations of the new QDDR, Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, that is designed to realign the State Department to address what we are terming civilian security in a much more integrated and holistic fashion. So I would really commend and welcome the value of this discussion and the strain of work that you've all done in informing our thinking on how we are approaching these changes. I literally am working with the Undersecretary, and a lot of us are, to think about how we build synergies with the very fine work that AID has done for quite a few years on this, our colleagues at DOD, but internally also how we are going to best use the combined power of the resources that we will have at State in bringing together the bureaus responsible for narcotics, law enforcement, population, refugees, migration, the sort of our surge capacity and through the CRS, conflict response teams that have been developed at State. For the first time, this is all moving together, and you can talk about bureaucratic obstacles and things taking a long time. Well, we have the advantage really of a window right now where we can, I think, use the examples of the work that you've done to help us better align these resources to make sure that the State Department, as well as the U.S. Foreign Ministry, does not overlook these critical links, and that environment and natural resources are integrated in all of our thinking and as we address conflict and post-conflict situations. So I just wanted to say, we appreciate the opportunity to hear this type of informed discussion and look forward to building partnerships with some of the academic and NGO community that's worked on this, as well as with our own U.S. agency colleagues, interagency colleagues. Thanks.
Can I throw a question back to you? Because I think this is a critically important process that you all are working on, and it is not something that happens every year or even every administration. And so it's a terrific opportunity. Do you see as kind of useful tools in pushing the process along, the use of particular examples, whether they be country or topical, that would allow you to then kind of get the right people in the room and think through it in that realm? Or is it, and it could be or is it the larger, making the case in the larger theoretical and the connection? I mean, I'm presuming in some ways the QDDR is the statement on the analytical, and now you're on to onto the specific. But is there guidance in terms of folks in and out of government where the kinds of things that would be helpful for you to move things forward in terms of specifics?
I think you've correctly identified, Jeff, that we are sort of considering the QDDR as as the overarching analytical statement. Although I will say, we're trying to fill in some gaps in terms of looking at environment and conflict in particular. What we're hoping that would be most useful is to look at precisely national or regional case studies and bringing people together from a range of sort of within government and outside of government institutions and affiliations to bear on particular case studies. And I know there's one kind of cooking up on South China Sea, for example, at State. So, but thanks, and we look forward to maybe working more closely with you on these, and certainly would let you know when we, as we go forward. Thanks.
Terrific. Well, I think we all have a strong interest in seeing you succeed in this endeavor. So, however we can all be helpful as a community to having it happen, that'd be terrific. Yes, there's a question over here, Frank.
Hi, Frank Femia with the Connect US Fund. I have a question for Dan, or I'm happy for it to be answered by anyone on the panel. It regards what you mentioned, what you said about climate finance and how the focus has been on how much rather than how. So it seems to me that the how much question has been answered by any number of different institutions, governments, et cetera. So ranging from 350 billion to 100, which came out of Copenhagen. And my question is, but since then, I think the money actually hasn't quite materialized, and I think so that question is not academic, but it's been answered, but it hasn't really materialized. And I think then coming out of Cancun, the focus on how sort of materialized around the Green Climate Fund. And so my question, I guess, is on that is how a Green Climate Fund, which will likely not have any money in it in the future, but in the near term. But my question would be around, what are your perceptions of that process? I think right now the model is, this is a UNFCCC fund that has the World Bank as a trustee. So I guess, and this question I think can go to anyone, do you see that process as constructive? Is it answering, or is the design question of the fund answering some of the questions that you have about, how that money is spent, et cetera? So
I think I'd defer to Alexandra on this one.
Okay. I mean, at the moment, I'm not familiar with the kind of regulations that apply to spending money on that. But I would assume that that I think you raised that earlier, that it depends on the very specific requirements and what we no matter how much money we spend on that. I think it affects the scale of transition that we could achieve in these countries, but we have no mandatory regulations at hand that address specifically the question of conflict sensitivity. I mean, if you go to the different international and regional financial institutions and look at the guidance notes and safeguards that they have available, I'm not familiar with any of the safeguards that address the question of security implications or likely security implications of any kind of large-scale investment. I mean, they do have provisions of doing integrated environmental assessments, and some, or not some, but the majority looks at larger implications for in terms of socioeconomic impacts. And it depends then how, as you said, how institutions then further develop that, because these are either guidance notes or safeguards, and then it depends really on the institutions how rigid they are in order to make use of them. For instance, when it comes to as I mentioned, the study that we did and some other work that we did for the Nile Basin Initiative, I think it's less the question of safeguards that exist but it's very much dependent on the political will and by institutions really to address these questions, because the framework exists, and most of this kind of investment requires large-scale and very long-term societal processes that need moderation. I think at that point it might be less just the question of mere written regulations to that. But conflict is not an issue there.
Dan, I wanted to, I neglected to tell you this, that I was going to ask you this, but I wanted to ask you, the changes in DFID's announced policy of reprioritizing countries to focus money on conflict-affected countries. Does that suggest to you that there's a greater moment of opportunity in that context, as much as A, DFID is a big player, and B, also a thought leader in development realms? Or is that a misperception from the outside?
I don't think. I mean, what has happened is that the UK coalition government, which came in May last year, announced a series of aid reviews. There was the BAR, the MAR, the HAR, and the PAR. Bilateral aid review, the multilateral aid review, the humanitarian aid review, and I forget what PAR stood for, but maybe that was somebody who made it up. It was just a joke, and I wasn't paying attention. And these reviews have now reported. I think the humanitarian aid review is actually reporting this week, and I haven't really seen more than some bare outline indications. But the multilateral aid review, which was about support to the UNDPs and other UN agencies and so on, and the bilateral aid review, which is the one that you referred to, which reduced the number of focus countries down to, I think, 27, with a enormous emphasis onto fragile and conflict-affected states. Those both reported about a month ago. And I think that in some ways the big policy shift or the big policy message had already been given, because DFID's focus is there's 5 pillars. The private sector, value for money, which means just being efficient about the aid projects, gender equity and women's participation, climate, effects of climate change, especially on the poorest people in the world, and work in fragile and conflict-affected states. So this sort of targeting of DFID's main work, as far as the messages are being given, onto a relatively limited range of issues, and of taking those issues as the lens through which standard development sectors like education, health, infrastructure, clean water would be seen. I think that's enormously important. And I think it's of equal importance, the third, fourth, and fifth pillars that I mentioned, women and gender, climate, and conflict and fragility. And if that is taken seriously and pushed through, then it will mean quite a shift in the way in which DFID is really thinking about its role. With the World Development Report coming out fairly soon, I don't know, it's been constantly been delayed. Whenever you talk to people who are engaged in it, it's sort of, yes, it'll be coming out at the beginning of 2011, soon after, a little bit later. I'm not sure if it's April or May is the target date at the moment. It's April. But what we hear is that it has all been nailed down. It's definitely going to be launched out. And I think that will be another important part of moving the discussion on. And I think that the headline way in which the discussion moves is partly to say, and this is very important in thinking about how the whole development agenda moves as we come into the final years before 2015, which was the target date for the Millennium Development Goals. I think the headlines of the way in which the discussion is moving is more or less to say, look, a certain range of development tasks which were seen as being essential in 1999 and 2000 as the millennium came upon us, progress has been registered on them where it's possible to register them. And that has left a number of the most difficult cases, which are actually the countries and the cases that we've been implicitly or actually talking about today in this session. these are the countries where, you know, you don't have so many successes to reward. These are the countries where incentives are just going to fall flat on the ground. But nonetheless, there's hundreds of millions, and I think it's going to be a figure in the WDR. There's 1.5 billion people living in these countries. And first of all, we have a moral imperative that we who are more fortunate should not turn our back on them. And secondly, we have a self-interested imperative that we benefit from a more prosperous and a more stable world. And these conditions of poverty and poor governance and lack of governance in some countries are feeding those things which we most fear and which most threaten us. So that is where I think increasingly the effort is going to fall. And I don't think it's just the aid review process in DFID which has done that in the last year. I think that's been a shift which I could see in the UK policy establishment on this issue over the last 2 to 3 years. And to be very frank with you, International Alert, I mean the organisation that I head, is very much a part of that shift. It's a shift which makes an awful lot of sense to us. Maybe 7, 8 years ago, when we were saying that in order to make progress on development, you needed to make progress on the conflict and peace issues, we were seen as being a little far out there. I mean, that was a little bit strange. Now, I mean, I'm uncomfortably sitting in the mainstream. I don't quite know what to do about this. I'll have to find some issue to make myself unpopular on again.
All right. Well, Dan, I'm absolutely certain that you'll be able to do that.
Jeff and I have known each other for many years, so you can rely on that.
That's right. To productive ends, of course. Well, Alexander, Dan, I really appreciate your laying out some of these issues for us where we still we're pretty good, I think, in kind of the diagnosis of the and the deductive argument and seeing how it's playing out. We're still a long way, I think, from really having some strong answers and strong advice and systematically how it's addressed in the field. Of course, problem recognition and kind of analysis of the problem is the first step, but it gives us obviously something to work on as a community and in your individual organizations. And Neil, thank you and your colleagues for this opportunity under strategic partnership with the Wilson Center and CMM. As I alluded to up front, this is something that feels a little funny to be having a session to launch it in that we've been working together closely for months now, and then even before that, before we had this in the more formal. I would urge you for some of that work, you'll be able to access that on places like New Security Beat, our blog, that includes videos, including, among others, Cynthia talking about how these issues are working and are worked on at AID, and find a lot of this work online where we're hopefully directing you to new research and new policy discussions, because it really does require us to step outside our normal inbox and try to learn from one another and find ways to collaborate to really put these things in effect. So please won't you join me in thanking our panel for today's discussion.